Viruses, organisms so mysterious that scientists cannot agree on whether or not they are alive. They do not fit all the criteria for life, but according to NASA, that's not what matters. Viruses cause disease in cellular life. They cannot reproduce without a host. They are responsible for many pieces of the genomes of cellular life. They are important, but are they alive?
So the first question I have for you is, are viruses alive? Why or why not?
Okay, so I think it depends largely on the definition. So the biggest thing about viruses that's different from what we know as the domains of life is that viruses don't need to do metabolism, meaning they don't need to eat, they don't need to process things for energy, they simply host on something else to reproduce. So according to the standard textbook biology definition, no. So I think I'm gonna have to go with the textbook on this one.
After spending time researching it years ago and then brushing up again, I feel that viruses are not alive. And even though there are so many incredible pieces of evidence that we're receiving now as technology advances, the thing about viruses is that they are not able to sustain all of these functions without being attached to another cell or bacteria or organism. And if they were to try to live entirely on their own, they wouldn't be able to function. They're only alive when they end up attaching to a form of a host. So in my opinion, I feel that they're not alive.
The next question I have for you is, which do you prefer, the criteria for life or NASA's definition of life, and why? NASA's definition of life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution.
Yeah, so with that definition, if we skip over the biology textbook and go to NASA for this one, by that definition, viruses are living because viruses do evolve. And unfortunately, we've had one bug us since 2020 that has constantly evolved and changed and developed some resistance to things. So according to that NASA definition, I mean, if things are changing and evolving and their genetics are changing, I do like the NASA definition of life.
I like the criteria for life better than NASA's because NASA's, I feel, is too generalized. I feel like when it comes to science, it's a lot easier when everything is clear cut and down to very specific requirements. I feel like NASA's is a little too gray area, and I understand that, you know, they make it gray area so that if other life on other planets was discovered, it would fit that definition. But when it comes to viruses or other things on Earth that we are trying to determine if they are alive or not, I feel that the criteria of life reflects what we consider living organisms a little bit better than NASA's does. NASA's is a little too general in my opinion, because when we talk about self-sustaining chemical systems, even though, like, for example, our bodies are able to carry out all of these chemical functions, it starts to get a little gray area when you start to think of different organisms or even humans with health issues that need to rely on supplements or medications or certain treatments in order to carry out those functions, but we're still self-sustainable. So I feel like because it's so general, it does create a lot of gray areas, so I do prefer the criteria for life.
Do you think the relationship between giant viruses and virophages provides evidence that viruses are alive? Why or why not?
I think that it's a very interesting concept, and it does bring something new to the table, but I don't think that it exactly presents a solid argument for if viruses are alive, because even though the virophages are able to attach to the giant viruses, they still can't live on their own. They wouldn't be able to survive without that host, without taking its structure and using it to reproduce, to carry out normal functions, to evolutionize. So while it's an interesting concept and it is something I'm glad that we're continuing to explore, I don't believe that it really gives that solid evidence that we need to prove that viruses are alive.
Next question. In terms of this debate, what are your thoughts on bacteria such as Wolbachia that can't survive or reproduce without a host cell?
That's a great question. What are my thoughts about Wolbachia who can reproduce without a host cell? So with that, as long as something can reproduce, it's considered living. So I don't think that really influences the debate if viruses are living or not. because they have a host or don't have a host, they can still reproduce. And reproduction is a characteristic of living things. So check, put that in the living category.
What are your opinions on mitochondria and chloroplasts, since they are not considered alive, even though we now know that they were once independent prokaryotes?
Great question. I would say, one, my opinion on them is that they're great. And they're best friends, which is my favorite part about them. My opinion on whether or not they are considered being alive, even though they were once living things, is if we're deeming them as bacteria, or originally deriving from a free living bacteria, bacteria are living, so check, put them in the living category.
So even though they each have their own DNA and they're able to carry out these functions, they cannot survive and carry out these functions outside of a cell. So the way that I see it is that they are able to live because they're in this little home of an area. If they were to leave that, they would not be able to carry out these functions. And the way that I see this, with all of this discussion nowadays, if embryos are actually living, it makes me think of that, because embryos can carry out those functions when they are attached to that host, when they are in the uterus. But if they were removed from that uterus, they wouldn't be able to carry out those functions. So I think it's the same kind of scenario here. While they do meet some of that criteria and they're able to carry out these functions, they're not alive, because if they were to be removed, they wouldn't be able to do any of that.
Is there anything else you'd like to add on the subject?
No, stay curious, investigate, explore, and maybe we change the textbooks in a few years and call this domain vira and classify viruses as living things.
I just think that this topic is really interesting, because the really cool thing about science is that it's always changing and we're always learning new things. So like 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, we probably didn't know as much as we do about it now. And if you were to interview me and ask me these questions in another 20, 30 years, we might know even new evidence. By that time, scientists might have been able to completely prove that viruses are alive. And I just find it fascinating that as time goes on, we have this new technology and we're able to find new evidence every day to support this or to go against this.
All right, thank you.